And Tim, a very good morning to you, and thanks for your time this morning. Give us some idea. I mean, when we talk about the number of child soldiers doubling over the past 7 years, or more than doubling, and the exploitation of girl children, what is happening to them?
Well, wherever, wherever we see conflict, sadly, we do see children who are very much against their will brought into that conflict. I mean, speaking of the situation here in South Sudan, where I am in the capital, Juba, we estimate that there are about 19,000 children who are serving in various armed groups and armed forces. And that is despite the fact that over the past year, we have had some good news, and we've seen around 1,000 children who have been released in the past 12 months. But, you know, South Sudan, we hope, is coming out of 5 years of civil war. We have a peace agreement at the moment. We hope there'll be many more releases. But, you know, 19,000 children will take a long time to demobilize. And so this is a long-term process. It's one which requires many years of follow-up as well, because, of course, these children have been through horrific events. They've witnessed terrible things. They've been abused and beaten. And so they require long-term support, psychological care, of course, support to their families, support to their communities, in order for them to see a viable future for themselves beyond these armed groups. Because sadly, here in South Sudan and in other parts of the country, we do see the re-recruitment of children as well. Once children are released, we need to work hard to ensure that they stay with their families and are not re-recruited either by force or voluntarily. We do see children joining these groups voluntarily at times, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, Tim, I want to talk more about how they reintegrate and if that's possible, but I want to go back to the beginning, and I want to talk about, just what actually happens, how these children are actually taken from their families, how do they end up as child soldiers? I mean, I know we've seen the documentaries, we've seen what happens, but bring it home for us as to what you've seen and the cases that you've had to work on.
I mean, there are different circumstances, as I was just mentioning, but I was in the southwest of the country just about 6 weeks ago, where I spoke to a young woman and a young man who had both been abducted. The young man was at his home when armed men stormed the home, and they took both him and his brother, and he was forced to work, as he said, as a porter and as a messenger. And the young woman that I spoke to, she was simply walking home from school. She was returning to her home at the end of a school day, and armed men in a vehicle stopped her on the road and pulled her into the vehicle. And then that was the end of her normal life for 3 years until she was ultimately released, and now she's receiving vocational training. But, you know, that's the case for the majority of children. They are forcibly brought into these groups. But, you know, it is important to remember that there are some who go voluntarily because they really see no options for themselves. You know, the family's going hungry, and if they join an armed group, they'll be fed. You know, they'll have a sense of purpose. They'll have a sense of power. I mean, they're children. They can't make these kind of informed decisions. But yeah, the majority of these children are very much taken against their will.
And how young, are we seeing kids being recruited at how young an age, Tim, do we see? I mean, the youngest children that you're seeing?
It covers all ages. I mean, we have a group of staff going down to this, where I was 6 weeks ago, a town called Yambio in the southwest of the country, bordering the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We're going to see the release today of more than 100 children, and the youngest child among that group is a boy of 10 years old. So that gives you an indication that the commanders of these groups, when they are abducting children, there really is no child too young. I mean, we do know, I've met with individuals who were released by armed groups because they couldn't keep up and they were seen as a burden. But and it's also important to remember that not all of these children are put into combat roles. They may not be issued a weapon. They may not be expected to fire a weapon. Many of them, particularly the girls, might be used to do domestic chores. They might be married off, sadly, in some situations. And many of the boys, particularly the younger, smaller boys, might be assigned roles as messengers and porters and sometimes bodyguards to commanders.
And then before I let you go, Tim, I mean, the world reaction to this, we know what's happening, we know where it's happening, we know who's responsible for it, but what are we doing?
Well, I mean, many of the parties involved in this need to live up to commitments that they've already made. I mean, this is the year in which the Convention on the Rights of the Child will be 30 years old. And that states very clearly, that children have an absolute right not to be recruited into armed groups. There are many governments who have signed this document, this declaration, but the recruitment and use of children continues. As I said, basically wherever there is conflict, wherever you have armed forces and militias fighting against each other, sadly, children are brought into this, and what that results in is the end of their childhood. I mean, their lives are scarred for many, many years, and they continue to need long-term support if they are able to really rehabilitate themselves and return to normal lives.
And that's possible? I mean, successful rehabilitation, successful reintegration. Have you seen it, Tim?
Yes, I have. In fact, I was speaking to a young woman recently, and she was receiving training as a tailor. She had challenges. She had 2 young children, but she could see that she was able to see a future for herself in which she could support herself, support her children. She was still a 17-year-old girl, really, but with support, with long-term support, obviously with psychological support. But it's so crucial that they are able to see a means of life beyond these groups. And for many, that's education. That's primarily the number one thing that they want. And for others, it's training in means of which they can earn a living.
Thanks very much for your time and that insight. That's UNICEF's Tim Irwin.